Picture this. It's 2020. The world comes to a pause as everyone has to deal with a rapidly spreading disease. Because of that, you can't do as many things as you used to do. So with all this new free time, you decide to pick up a new hobby. And that is exactly what I did. One day I simply decided that I wanted to learn a new language. Now, my history with languages is a bit unique. I was born and grew up entirely in Mexico. In fact, as of me making this video, I have never traveled outside the country. And yet I can speak and understand English almost as well as a native speaker. Granted, my pronunciation still needs some work, but the point still stands that I can communicate in English just as well as I can in Spanish. And sometimes I can actually communicate better in English because I spend most of my days online and I'm constantly surrounded by English speakers. So how the hell did this happen? Simple. My parents believed that I would have better job opportunities if I learned English, so from a very young age they tried to expose me to the language by playing TV shows for me in English, or listening to music in English. That, alongside the fact that English is a mandatory subject in schools here, helped me get a decent grasp on the language. Besides that, I also attended a Christian school where all the textbooks were in English. That's a story for another time. I also worked at a call center where I had to talk to angry Xfinity customers concerned about their broken equipment. Again, another story for another time. And perhaps the thing that helped me the most, watching YouTube in English. Okay, that's a cute story and all, but how does this tie to me learning another language or the topic of this video? Patience. I'm getting there. Besides being exposed to English through the media I consumed, I also started dipping my toes into anime. Specifically, after watching Sword Art Online on Netflix, I became kind of obsessed with anime for a little bit, and that got me interested in learning Japanese someday. Fast forward to 2020, and that's where I found myself. I had a lot of time to dedicate to a new hobby, and so I decided to use that time to learn Japanese. Little did I know, though, that that simple decision would lead me to one of the best and most interesting rabbit holes in history. 日本語だけ学んだだけでなく, but I was also learning about the field of linguistics. I was learning how languages work, how words organize to form sentences differently in different languages, and where languages came from. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to tell you about all the things I learned about languages, what they are, how they work, where they came from, and why languages are so important to us. Why? Because Hey, slight continuity error. So I got sick during the recording of this video, so if you notice my voice sound a bit more nasally now, sorry, not sorry. No, I can control this. So, humans are animals. That is a fact that unfortunately many people today tend to forget, but yeah, we're not plants, we're not bacteria, we're not fungi, we're animals. And as most animals do, we have a way to communicate with each other. The difference between other animals and humans is that humans take communication to a whole other level. According to Google, language is defined as the principal method of human communication consisting of words used in a structured and conventional way, conveyed by speech, writing, or gesture. Focusing on speech for now, because that's what most people use, we basically took simple sounds and organized them in such ways that we made words. But words themselves don't mean much if they're just said by themselves, so as we did with individual sounds, we also organized words into sentences, thus creating grammar, the rules by which a language is structured. And it's important to also note that speech is not the only form of language. Sign language and writing are also methods of communication. Today, there are 7 criteria used to classify languages and distinguish them from dialects or from dead languages. These criteria are standardization, vitality, historicity, autonomy, reduction, mixture, and de facto norms. Standardization refers to a way in which the language is codified, whether it's a translation of an important text, like the Bible for example, or a dictionary with standard definitions for words, or even entire organizations like the Real Academia Española, which is in charge of Spanish's standard form. It's basically a way of organizing a language that every speaker can understand. Though this can be a bit tricky to pull off since languages are constantly changing, and some of these changes can cause some controversy because they're diverging from a standard, which some people perceive as a wrong or incorrect form of the language. An example of this is using different plural forms, like saying many ice creams instead of many ice cream. Vitality is essentially whether or not there are native speakers of a language. Take Latin or Ancient Greek for example. Those are what I refer to as dead languages because there are no people whose very first language was Latin or Ancient Greek. There's only the written standard forms that were left in historical documents. That's not to say that those languages don't have an impact in the world now though. Their vocabulary still survives in other living languages, like English for example, as well as languages that evolved from Latin and Ancient Greek. Historicity, or as I prefer to call it, historical ties, is just that, the ties that the group of speakers of that language has had to that language throughout history. This is important because it's what unites these groups of people into big communities. It's what unified Germany in the 19th century and what unites Catalans in their fight for independence today. Autonomy is essentially whether or not you feel like your language is different from other similar languages. It's It's more about feelings than anything else, but if you don't feel a big enough difference to distinguish between similar languages, then what's really the point of separating them? Reduction is having varieties of the language being classified as varieties rather than their own languages. Mixture refers to how pure the speakers of the language feel their language is, or in other words, how much of their language is their own versus how much of it is things from other languages. For example, English's core vocabulary is Germanic in origin, but it also has a lot of loanwords from French, Latin, Greek, etc., so some might argue that English isn't very pure. And finally, de facto norms is similar to standardization in the sense that the language has to have established rules, and there are also distinctions between speaking properly and not. All of these criteria are very useful to organize and categorize languages in the world, which can get pretty tricky because sometimes the line between one language and another is not very clear. A very good and common example of this is dialect continuums, actually. They're like language spectrums where the further away two dialects are from each other, the less they're gonna understand each other, which means that dialect A can understand dialect B can understand dialect C can understand dialect D, but dialect A cannot understand dialect D. And a great example of this dialect continuum thingy is actually English. It forms a dialect continuum throughout the island of Great Britain, where if someone living in Hampshire talks to someone living in Edinburgh, they're probably not going to understand each other very well. But if that person from Hampshire talks to someone from London or Oxfordshire, they will understand each other a lot better. This phenomenon causes a lot of debate between what counts as a language and what doesn't. For instance, many people debate whether or not Scots is a language or a dialect of English, since it's on English's dialect continuum, but can sound very different from other English dialects.
For the victims of Scotland's 2011 census, almost 12 million folk have some skill with the Scots lead.
Now, I personally find some of these criteria a little bit problematic because I believe that in everyday speech, there is no right or wrong way of speaking. I think it's more of a matter of what sounds natural to you and what doesn't, which changes from person to person. That's why there are so many variations of a language, because everyone speaks slightly differently. But personal feelings aside, I do believe that the criteria are accurate and even necessary for standard versions of a language, and having them can be pretty damn useful, especially for people who want to learn your language, because having standardized and organized rules makes the learning process a whole lot easier. At least as long as the standard is updated with new developments popping up as the language evolves. Okay, so to summarize this section, a language is humans' main method of communication, involving words, spoken, signed, or written, organized in specific ways to convey meaning. And the way we differentiate between languages and dialects relies on the language having a standardized form, having varieties that are classified as varieties of that language, and having a community of native speakers of that language that also have a strong tie to their language. Okay, this is cool and all, but I want to go back a little bit to when I mentioned that thing about languages coming from Latin or ancient Greek. What does that mean? Well, you see, my dear viewer, languages change over time. We know that, right? They are constantly changing, they are constantly evolving. And if that's the case now, it probably means that's been the case for a while too.
What did I say?
What
did I tell you to do?
To make good graphics.
Good graphics! I come to work and I have to look at this mess!
I can make good graphics.
You better make good graphics!
Hundreds, thousands, probably even millions of years? So that's what I want to talk about in the next section, because it's a very interesting question that's been on my mind for a while. How do languages change? How do they evolve? Where they came from? All of that cool stuff. So let's move on. Since evidence gets harder to get the further back you go in time, it's also harder to learn where some things came from. An example of this is how non-living material became life. We know that the most essential elements for life can self-assemble into organic molecules. That's what's known as abiogenesis. However, we don't know how exactly these organic molecules got together and formed the first life forms yet. It's a bit of a barrier in biology and chemistry. In the same way, how humans develop language is a bit of a barrier in the field of linguistics. We simply don't know exactly how it happened. Try to think of the simplest forms of communication. You can point at things, make a sound when you get hurt, or frown when you get upset. You can also think outside the human box and look at other animals. Maybe you have a dog using the scent of their urine to indicate that that territory is marked, or a cat that lets you know if they want you to keep them food or not, or a frog using bright coloration to indicate that they're poisonous. Communication has always existed in animals, even in primates, but how those forms of communications evolved into languages remains a mystery, though there are some theories that might explain it. Some scholars believe that language came from a single place, and as humans migrated all around the world, that language changed in different ways in different regions, similar to how modern language families are formed. That is called the Tower of Babel theory. There is also the possibility that language evolved in different places independently. This is called the proto-world theory. I'm personally a bit more inclined to believe this theory because different groups of people living in different environments would have had to have different expressions depending on the environment they lived in. You wouldn't really expect a group of early humans to have a quote-unquote word for lizard if they're living in a cold, snowy environment, and another group of early humans to have a word for snow if they lived in a warmer environment like a desert, for example. Which leads me to imitations. Some people theorize that a lot of the words we use today probably came from imitating animal sounds or sounds from their environment, or from grunts, sighs, and cries that we've made when feeling certain emotions. There's also a theory suggesting that we might have used sounds and exclamations we used in manual labor, like moving heavy logs or rowing boats. I personally believe that a combination of all of these is what led to the most basic forms of language, which ended up developing into something more complex. There are also some physical features found in the remains of ancient humans that would have allowed them to make more complex vocalizations and sounds, which would have helped them with communicating more things. There are only so many ways you can grunt to communicate something, but if you add other sounds before, after, or even in the middle of a grunt, you can now expand the amount of things you can communicate. Some of these changes include things like the position of the larynx, which is lower in humans than in other primates. This created a longer cavity above it called the pharynx, which helped with the range and clarity of the sounds we make in our vocal tract. It also makes it possible for us to inhale and choke on our own food, so the fact that this feature stuck around in humans for so long should be enough evidence that it was at least useful for something. Evidence of this sort of changes go back around 2 million years with Homo erectus, which means that language, or at least a simpler form of language, might have originated in other human species that aren't Homo sapiens. Hey, I just wanted to add this little note here because I felt like I needed to be a bit more specific about this, because the evidence is not very clear in regards of whether or not the Homo erectus could speak. There are some things to suggest that they could, like the size and functions of their brains. Their hyoid bone was very similar to ours, but it also shows traits of pre-human species, so I don't know, it's not very conclusive, but it's possible that they had, at the very least, a very archaic form of the languages we use today. So just wanted to throw that out there, like, take this with a bit of a grain of salt. I know this is all a bit vague and speculative, but that's just what the best scientific evidence tells us so far. Like I said, the origins of language are a bit of a mystery, but we have some ideas about how it could have originated. And believe me, I could have given you a lot more information about this, but I don't really want to make a 10-hour video, so as always, all of my sources will be down in the description below if you want to learn more. So that's about where we are in terms of how humans develop language. But what about our modern languages? How did they pop up specifically? Allow me to introduce you to language families. English, German, Norwegian, Dutch, Icelandic, Frisian, Swedish. What do all these languages have in common? They are all part of the Germanic language family. Now, just to clarify, because the name might be confusing to some, this does not mean that all of these languages came from German, or that German is the oldest of all of these languages. Rather, it means that all of these languages share a common ancestor, which is called Proto-Germanic, hence the name of the Germanic language family. That's what a language family is, a group of languages that share a common ancestor, or in other words, that come from the same language. We can use more languages as examples. Spanish, French, Italian, Romanian, Portuguese, and Catalan are all part of the Romance language family, because they all evolved from the language of the Romans, aka Latin. Czech, Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, and the Serbo-Croatian languages all form the Slavic language family. Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Manx, Welsh, and Breton form the Celtic language family. Arabic, Hebrew, Coptic, Assyrian, and Aramaic are all in the Semitic language family. You get the point. There are lots of languages that share a common ancestor. Not all of them, some of them are language isolates, which means that they have no known relation to other languages, like Japanese, Korean, Euskera, etc. But how do we know that? How can someone tell that two or more languages are related to each other? If you compare words in languages that are geographically close to each other, you're going to see some similarities. Let's look at the Romance languages as an example and compare some words in those languages. Just a small disclaimer though, I am not good at speaking most of these languages, so I'm gonna mispronounce some stuff. I apologize in advance. Spanish, pie. Portuguese, pé. French, pied. Italian, piede. Romanian, picior. Catalan, peu. Spanish, luna. Portuguese, lua. French, lune. Italian, luna. Romanian, luna. Catalan, lluna. Spanish, lluvia. Portuguese, chuva. French, pluie. Italian, piovere. Romanian, ploaie. Catalan, pluja. All of these are separate languages that sound different from one another and are spoken in different parts of the world. And yet they have so many similarities to the point where it just wouldn't make sense that all of them popped up out of nowhere just because. So the most logical answer would be that at some point those languages were more similar to each other and they ended up diverging and changing independently of one another. And as a small note, I want to mention that linguistics also relies on other forms of science. Sticking with the Romance languages as an example, we have a lot of written records of Latin. We know where Latin was spoken, we know the expanse of the Roman Empire, we have archaeological evidence to see where the Roman Empire expanded to, so that gives us a pretty decent idea of where Latin was spoken and where it started evolving differently. And not just that, but we also have written evidence of earlier versions of those languages, which gives us pretty solid evidence about how those languages evolved, although written evidence is not always necessary because sound changes are fairly predictable, so you can get a lot of information from that. Though one thing you have to be aware of with this method is borrowed words. Words used in a language that originate from another language. An example of a borrowed word is sushi. The word comes from Japanese, but we use it in English to describe a kind of food. Now, here's where it gets juicy, because you can compare language and determine which ones are related to one another. But when you study those sound differences and how they evolve, eventually you're gonna get to the place where those sounds originated. In other words, you can find the sound or what the word sounded like in the common ancestor of those languages, which means that you can reconstruct those proto-languages, which means that yes, we know what the common ancestors of Romance, Germanic, Celtic, and Slavic languages that I mentioned earlier sound like. But we can take it one step further. A lot of those proto-languages only date back a couple hundred or a couple thousand years, but as we've discussed before, there's evidence to suggest that languages would have existed as far as 2 million years ago, which means that there were definitely languages before them, and lo and behold, we can actually find a lot of similarities in some of these proto-languages, so we can also apply the comparative method to them. Sticking with Germanic, Roman, Slavic, and Celtic languages, we can compare all those proto-languages, as well as other related language families that I didn't mention, and we can reconstruct their parent language, the common ancestor of most of the languages spoken from the Iberian Peninsula to the north of India and everywhere in between, Proto-Indo-European. If your mind isn't blown by this, I don't know what to tell you. You're either hard to impress, you're not paying attention, or you already knew this, in which case, why the fuck are you watching? Proto-Indo-European isn't the only language family though. There's also the Afro-Asiatic languages, the Sino-Tibetan languages, and a fuck ton of other language families all around the world. Important thing to note here. These language families that I mentioned are not the oldest languages in the world. They're just the oldest point where our current living languages converge. So, what did we learn in this section? We learned that language is humans' main method of communication. We don't exactly know how language popped up, but we have some ideas. Some of the earliest evidence for human speaking language go back around 2 million years, and languages today evolved and diverged from parent languages, so to speak, and we can trace back their evolution, and we can categorize all those related languages into language families. Lots of information, but we're not done yet. Linguistics isn't just about studying the evolution of languages, but also about learning about the parts and rules that make up a language and how they work, which is what we're gonna cover in our next section. Languages require 2 essential parts, vocabulary and grammar. Vocabulary is the set of sounds, signs, or expressions that communicate to others about physical objects or abstract thoughts, or to put it simply, words. Now, grammar is kind of like the rope that ties the hay bale. It gives structure to the pile of words that language is made of. It tells us which words go before other words, or if we're talking about a thing that we're not even mentioning in our sentence that we might have talked about before. Words come in all shapes and sizes, which sometimes makes the line between what counts as a word and what doesn't a bit blurry. I'll let Tom Scott explain that a bit better.
If you accept the definition that a word is some letters surrounded by a gap, then Knoppet and are all words, despite being pretty much meaningless. You certainly can't rely on dictionaries to define what's a real word either. There are plenty of words that people use every day that haven't made it into standard dictionaries. How about synthetic languages? Ones where, in extreme cases, you can put an entire sentence's worth of meaning into one long string of characters or sounds. Is that still one word?
I do recommend giving that whole video a watch because I will reference it a lot for this. It will be with the rest of my sources in the description below. The way languages organize their words can vary quite a bit depending on what kind of language they are. There are agglutinative languages, languages where morphemes connect together to add meaning to words. An example of an agglutinative language is Japanese. In Japanese, you can take a morpheme meaning to play, attach another morpheme that indicates that the action is ongoing, and another morpheme that indicates that the action was made in the past. You've now made one big word out of other smaller words. That's what agglutinative languages are all about. Isolating languages. They're pretty much the opposite of agglutinative languages. They pretty much have no inflections in their words, and instead of attaching morphemes to each other, they use other words and context to convey inflection. If English was an isolating language, instead of saying I was playing, we would say something like I play ongoing past. Modern Chinese languages can be used as examples of isolating languages, but classical Chinese shows this form of language a lot better, as well as Vietnamese. Visional languages are very similar to agglutinative languages in the sense that they also use morphemes to modify the meanings of words. Most Indo-European languages like English, Spanish, and German fall into this category. The main difference is mostly how the modified word changes. In agglutinative languages, every morpheme retains more or less the original form, while in fusional languages, the modified word changes its shape and pronunciation to fit the modifying morpheme. And finally, polysynthetic languages are essentially agglutinative languages on steroids. They can make what would be entire sentences in English into one single, very long word by combining several morphemes and units of meaning. These kind of languages are relatively rare, but some examples of polysynthetic languages are the Mayan languages, Ainu, the Quechuan languages, etc. As you can see, all of these categories tend to overlap a little bit. I think it's important to see all of these not as boxes, but rather as part of a spectrum. I talked about Japanese being an agglutinative language and about German being a fusional language, but in reality, both languages have features that you could classify as agglutinative and fusional. They're both kind of in both categories at the same time. So based on all of this information, what becomes a word and what doesn't really depends on what language you're speaking. That's why there's terms like units of meaning or morphemes, so we can better talk about these things. And you can also see that grammar and words overlap a little bit. Grammar can't exist without units of meaning, and in a lot of cases, these units of meaning can't have a meaning without the structure that the grammar provides. I also want to briefly mention grammatical gender and cases. There is a lot I could talk about here, and I'm planning making a video especially on grammatical gender, but for now, I just want to mention the basics. So, grammatical gender is a bit of a confusing term because in reality, it has nothing to do with human gender expression, but rather it's a way of categorizing words. It's kind of similar to cases, which are ways to modify words to convey a grammatical function rather than using separate words for that. German, Russian, Icelandic, and even Old English are examples of languages with grammatical cases. Again, I could talk about these topics a lot more, but they really deserve their own videos. But for now, that is essentially how languages work. You use sounds, signs, or writing to convey a meaning about an object or an idea, and you organize those units of meaning in specific ways to express a thing, and that specific way can change depending on what kind of language you have. Language is arguably the most important thing to happen to humans. It allows us to communicate in so much more detail than other animals can. It allows us to work together, to share ideas, thoughts, and emotions. Some might argue that without language, we wouldn't have the intelligence, technological advancement, and creativity we have today. But it goes beyond that. The way we use language also affects how we perceive the world, and by proxy, how we treat the world and people around us. One example of this that I see very often is Spanish's grammatical gender. For those who are not familiar, Spanish has two grammatical genders, masculine and feminine. You can probably imagine how problematic this can be for people whose gender identity doesn't fit into that binary. Especially when we call that linguistic feature gender, even though, as I said before, it has nothing to do with human gender identity. As a consequence of this, there aren't a lot of people in the Spanish-speaking world that are very accepting of non-binary people. There have been attempts at introducing gender-neutral terms to Spanish, but those are typically frowned upon by most people, which means that I can't even talk about my non-binary friends in Spanish. People's language is affecting how they perceive the world and the people around them. Another less spicy example, some languages have different words for colors. Some languages only distinguish between light and dark and have no other terms for colors. Some other languages, like Old Japanese, had one word to describe green and blue. Spanish has separate words for light and dark blue, which don't exist in English. English distinguishes pink from red, but in some other languages they're the same color, just one is light and another one is dark. This can lead to one group of people having a harder time distinguishing between two colors, and another group of people distinguishing between those two colors perfectly fine. People's language is affecting how they perceive the world and the people around them. And this also applies to the way we use words. For example, it's not the same to ask a disabled person whether they can do a thing or not, and asking them how they can do a thing. It's a tiny difference, but it matters a lot. What I want to get at here is that we have to be aware of how we and the people we come across use language and for what purpose. Because there are lots of people out there using specific language to harm people intentionally or not. Or we might misinterpret what someone says because we didn't pay attention to the exact words that they were using. I truly believe that most of our issues today, whether it's in our relationships or with politics, stem from not communicating properly or even not communicating enough. Languages and the way we use them truly have an impact in the real world. It's why I'm so passionate about learning as many languages as I can. That way I can understand people and their perspectives a lot better, and I seriously encourage everyone to do so as well. So to summarize, we learned a lot about what language is, how it works, where it came from, and why it's so important to us. It's a fascinating thing to study and think about, and it's really a miracle that humans were lucky enough to have this wonderful, deep, and complex way of communicating. So please, use it, and use it well. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was really fun to research and to write. As always, if you want to learn more, all of my sources will be in the description. Don't forget to hit the like button and leave a comment for the algorithm gods. And subscribe to my channel if you don't want to miss out on my upcoming videos. Who knows, maybe I'll talk about the history of writing sometime soon, and trust me, if you liked what you learned here, you do not want to miss that one. Thank you very much for watching.